They said I joke too much, that I don't fit the mold. But last time I checked, I'm the one still bold.
Hey, welcome to another episode of the Heart and Hustle podcast. I'm your host, Homer Hargrove, and I know what you're thinking. Where were you last week? Well, obviously I was getting a haircut and things are busy. But today we are going to be talking about how progress is not linear. We're going to learn how to read growth without losing perspective. And I really want us to focus on the person who is trying to build something meaningful. And we will eventually run into, whether that's like a business, a church, even family, maybe it's a creative pursuit, even just like a healthier version of yourself. Maybe you're just like trying to either go through a weight loss journey or even like a fitness journey. And it's this moment where we have to recognize that progress doesn't move in a straight line. Growth isn't linear, and even though we expect it to be, we're usually taught that either directly or indirectly to expect this idea of like consistent upward momentum. We expect numbers to always be increasing if we're putting in this kind of work. Momentum is always supposed to build, and we think that results to always confirm that we're on the right track. But real life doesn't really work that way. And when we don't understand that, we start to interpret normal fluctuations as personal failures. And that's where discouragement sets in, and that's often where that imposter begins to take root. And what might be just like a normal expected plateau, you'll take as something that you're doing wrong. And so I want us to understand first, this idea of rhythm versus validation. One of the most important distinctions that we can make is the difference between the two. Numbers don't always exist to tell you whether you're doing a good job or a bad job. A lot of times they simply reflect a season that we may be in. For example, for me at our church, there are predictable times every year when attendance is higher and other times where it's much lower. And there's times of the year where families normally travel. There's times of the year where schedules change. And there's times where school starts or ends. And summer looks different than fall. None of these things mean that the church is shrinking or that something went wrong. But if I look at those numbers without context, I could easily tell myself a story that isn't true. I could assume that people are disengaged, that they're wanting to go to a different church. And not that it's kind of weird because we know that church is, like any church is good, but it's this idea of personal ownership, right? And, it's easy for me to even think that I said something wrong or that growth is slipping. And when we look at numbers that way, that they stop being informative and they start becoming emotional. Instead of helping you to lead, they start shaping how you feel about yourself. And that's where it can be dangerous because leaders begin to assign meaning to things that were never meant to carry that kind of weight. And sometimes numbers aren't really a verdict at all. They're just this pattern that is either repeating itself or a pattern that's reflective of like a unique change. Even, sticking in this lane of like our church attendance, there's also a period where just like kind of coincidentally, we had like a lot of military families in our church at one point to where they all ended up like moving at the same time. And so even though we had grown so much in this specific year, it looked like we didn't grow at all because all these families were moving away throughout the year. And so whatever growth we did have, it looked like we had a problem with retention. Like, oh no, we're doing something wrong. But it was really just an anomaly. And when we can look at numbers like that, we can realize we don't have to declare over ourselves that we're doing something wrong. We just are recognizing these rhythms and these patterns. And when I want us to now talk about with when numbers actually do signal a problem. So again, right now we're talking about how we don't need to look at it as a form of validation, but now I want us to look at how numbers can be useful for us for reflection. Not all numbers are neutral, and not all patterns should be ignored. This is where we have to really discover discernment. And there are moments when numbers aren't just showing rhythm, but are revealing something possibly unhealthy beneath the surface. I remember this unique moment where I once heard how this one leader at a church was really discouraged that at their church, they had gone through several different youth pastors in a short period of time. And each one seemed to have lasted less than a year before they quit. And the conclusion that they had come to was that younger leaders simply don't have the same heart or commitment as they did, or even as previous generations. They reminisce at like when they were growing up, they had the same youth pastor all throughout their student life, and how sad they were at how the kids at their church now aren't going to be able to experience that because of this constant shifting in young leadership. And it seemed like they were discouraged and disappointed at the next generation, the people younger than them. But when you look at the situation more honestly, the numbers weren't necessarily pointing to as much of like the youth pastors being a problem. Like that's a trend. See, that is a number that is showing a trend, and it was pointing to a culture problem. It was potentially pointing to a leadership problem. When the same role repeatedly burned people out, the issue isn't as much as the individual stepping into that role. The issue is more so the environment that they're stepping into. Patterns that like that are not necessarily seasonal. They're structural, and they indicate expectations that are unrealistic, or support systems that were missing, or leadership cultures that exhausted people rather than empower them. And see, this is where numbers became a mirror instead of a measuring stick. And it's not to exist to shame you, but they exist to invite responsibility, to see that the mistake isn't in seeing the numbers. It's in refusing to ask what these numbers are actually revealing. And this is the moment where we have to do our best not be emotional about these numbers. Even if I was, say, the person in charge of this church, and I'm recognizing, wow, these youth pastors are burning out over and over. What's going on? What's the problem? If this was a thought, then it's this moment of, rather than blaming others, rather than blaming the youth group or blaming the youth pastors, of taking an honest look, what is happening to where these people either feel ill-equipped or exasperated. That goes into maybe what it might not even be that I'm doing something wrong as a leader, but maybe I'm not preparing people enough of what to expect in the interview process. It's part of trying to figure that out. What even having an exit interview and asking, what is the number one reason of why you don't want to continue working here, and being able to hear some honest feedback. So again, this is a moment where we should not try to be emotional in these parts, because these are things that are within our realm of taking control and changing. Like I can change those kinds of behaviors. I can change those kind of structures. But it's when we let those kinds of reflections turn into, again, that validation, like, oh, it's just because I suck. Well, no, it maybe more so means that I can grow in my leadership. It doesn't mean that I just suck and there's nothing I can do about it. So I want us to now talk about leading without false guilt. And this is really what we're zoning in on. One of the hardest things to learn as a leader, or even just like as a person, is how to take responsibility without taking on that blame that doesn't belong to you. There's a difference between owning what you can control and internalizing everything that happens around you. Imposter syndrome often shows up when leaders assume that every downturn, every quiet season, or even every change is somehow a reflection of their inadequacy. And that is not humility. That is a misattribution of shame. And at the same time, there's also this temptation to avoid responsibility altogether by explaining away every issue as this is just how things are. And so we got one side where we're internalizing it and letting it consume our identity and cap our ceiling, and then this other side to where there's nothing we could do. It's just that's just how things are here. This is just how things have always been. That's how our town is. Our town is special and unique, not like any other town. And see that. The idea is that wisdom lives in the middle of these two realms. It's the balance between these two kinds of extremes. Healthy healthy leadership, or even just healthy personhood, means being honest about these systems that you've built, even if it comes to like being a parent, the systems of discipline and the disciplines of freedom and all these different little things that go into parenthood. We're talking about the culture that you've shaped, the expectations that you're setting, while also recognizing that not everything is yours to carry. And you can't control seasons. You can't control other people's life choices, especially as a parent. And you can't control every outcome. What you can control is how you respond and what you learn and what you're willing to adjust. Even just like going to this parent-child relationship, and seeing how this applies here. I have 3 kids, and there's times where they play great together and other times where they don't play great together, and they're always fighting and they're bickering. And those are moments where, if I just look at it, in this the wrong perspective, for lack of better words, then I could say, oh, what's wrong with my kids? They're always fighting. I don't see other kids fighting. And I'm putting these false narratives and ideas over them. Or I could even say like, oh, what did I do wrong? Something I'm doing is making them fight. Rather than just even looking at like, when do they fight? Well, they usually fight when after when near bedtime, when they're tired, or if they're before lunch when they're hungry, and starting to try to recognize these patterns rather than being overly emotional about it. There's also times where maybe they're bickering. They're saying, hey, they did this, they did that. And part of my role is learning this balance of, well, I can't control how they play. It's not necessarily my job, or do I want it to be my job to police playtime. And so again, we're learning how to give this reasonable kind of culture that we're setting even in our own home. Now, I want us to one final thing is to talk about realistic optimism and sustainable growth. This is where realistic optimism becomes essential, and this is the idea of optimism without realism turns into denial, and realism with optimism turns into cynicism. Well, sorry, let me say that all again. Optimism without realism turns into denial. And realism without optimism turns into cynicism. And those two things should be held together. And when they are held together, it creates this resilience. And realistic optimism allows you to believe in growth without demanding constant proof, this constant need of validation. It lets you to still stay hopeful in the quieter seasons without ignoring areas that need to change. It helps you to see progress as something that unfolds over time instead of something that has to announce itself immediately. And once you really start to recognize like even some of the patterns that we talked about earlier, like going back to my church example, now that I understand these specific patterns for our church and knowing the times that are lower attendance, I have strategic ideas and pathways for these low attendance seasons, to where we might have even like specific things that we talk about during that sermon series compared to like a high populated sermon series or a high populated month. It might be a time where I'm just trying to focus on growing our leadership team rather than trying to do an evangelistic event. We're trying to capitalize on these patterns and seasons rather than just, no, this is what we've always done, so we're going to keep doing it. We should just be realistic and optimistic with as we plan things out. Leaders who last, who endure, are not the ones who panic at every fluctuation or overcorrect at every dip. They are the ones who learn how to read the moment that they're in without losing confidence in the larger vision that they're walking. They understand that consistency matters more than intensity, and that faithfulness often looks boring long before it looks successful. So with all that being said, if you're in a season where things feel slower or different than you expected, that doesn't automatically mean something is wrong. It may simply mean that you're in a different rhythm that you were before. At the same time, if patterns keep repeating and the same issues keep surfacing, that may be an invitation to look deeper and make necessary changes. The goal isn't to defend yourself or to condemn yourself. The goal is clarity, to take responsibility for what's yours to own and release what isn't. And don't let imposter syndrome rewrite the story of your obedience. Growth is happening even when it doesn't look like the way that you thought it would. So all that being said, thanks for listening to the Heart and Hustle podcast today. If this episode helped you to reframe how you see progress, growth, please share it with somebody who might be questioning themselves right now. And as always, have a great life.
Yeah.